guys, it's Petra here from Petra Fisher Movement. I wanted to continue my squatting series from Instagram over here on YouTube because we're getting a little complicated today. We're going to get deeper into creating hip mobility. Hip mobility for squatting, what you need is hip flexion. You need the ability of your thigh bone to come towards your body. Now, there's a lot of reasons that your hip flexion could be limited. But one of the big ones might just be that you don't have enough ability for the capsule of the hip joint to get you into that kind of extreme deep hip flexion position. So we're going to go into FRC and kin stretch world today, and we're going to talk about some tools you can use to create real lasting changes in the mobility of your hip joints. Now, this class is going to be a little bit of a high-level overview. There's a lot of different restrictions that could be affecting your particular squat. But for the most part, what is going to be limiting people is a lack of space in the hip joint. There's not going to be enough ability for those bones to move close together. And in order to create space in the hip joint, things get a little bit weird. So what we want is flexion, right? We want that leg bone to come towards the pelvis without the back getting involved. But before you can have flexion, which is a linear path, you need to have rotation in the hip. It's just one of those weird principles of joint mobility where rotation comes before flexion and extension. And most of us are really lacking in hip rotation. So we're going to do a little bit of work in hip rotation, a little bit of work in hip flexion so you can experience both. But my suspicion is you're going to need to work more on the rotational stuff than you are on the actual flexion stuff, especially at first. So that's just one of the ways joints work, and that's how it is. We're going to use two types of tools today. We're going to use some hip cars because hip cars are awesome, and if you want a deeper dive into hip cars, my Joints for Life 2.0 course is coming out and is a great place to get a lot of good hip stuff. And then we're going to use a more advanced stretching tool called Pails Rails. So Pails Rails, progressive angular isometric loading, regressive angular isometric loading, really fancy acronyms for a slightly complicated stretching technique that works by helping your brain give you more room in the joint, and then you create force there so that in the end you get a noticeable change in mobility faster through your nervous system that then you can use to create true architectural mobility later on. So we're going to be doing some capsule hip cars. We're going to be doing some rotational Pails and Rails for the hip joints, and we're going to do some flexion Pails and Rails for the hip joints. So I'm going to walk you through it. We're going to use a timer so that we're getting some good time under tension here, and let's get started. We're going to start by lying down, and you can put something behind the back of your head. I didn't bring anything over with me, so I don't have anything, but a small pillow or a half dome is good. And what you're going to start by doing here is just put your hands on your pelvis so that you can feel if your pelvis starts to want to move around. Then you're going to lift your left femur up to 90 degrees. And now you're just going to rotate that femur so your foot goes to the outside and then your foot goes to the inside. Now, this rotation is called an axial movement. That means you're just moving your hip bone like a pig on a spit. You're not waving your knee relative to your hip joint. You're just going straight rotationally. So keep working on this rotation as I talk. What you're looking for here is the movement of your thigh bone. So as your thigh bone rolls inwards, that's internal rotation. As your thigh bone rotates outwards, that's external rotation. And your knee is just straight above your hip joint. So you're just kind of warming up here watching this rotation. Now this is the rotation I'm talking about where you need to have rotational capacity before you get flexion capacity. And you might be noticing already that you're feeling limited in one or both rotational directions here. You may be cramping a little bit. That's totally normal, and if you are, don't let it worry you. You may also notice that especially as your foot comes out, you want to lift up that hip. And that's a really common compensation for a lack of internal rotation, which is something most of us are severely lacking. I have a freakishly large amount of this because I was a W-sitter as a child. But if you don't have very much, that's fine. Just know that's something you're going to want to work on if you want to squat better, most likely. Let's switch sides. You can try the same thing on the right side. Hands go on your pelvis so that you can feel if you're moving your waist. And we're just quickly and lightly just kind of exploring what it's like to try rotating here. So this isn't even really a hip car. This is just a let's see what rotation is like in the hip. So external is when your thigh bone faces out and your foot goes in. Internal is when your thigh bone faces inwards, your foot faces out. It seems really backwards, but it's about the thigh bone and not about the foot. So just kind of warming up the hips here, hopefully feeling pretty good, experiencing some rotation, because we're going to come back to using this rotation. I want you to feel really, really confident with the sense of which way you're rotating. And that can take some time to practice, but give yourself the opportunity to feel what it's like in your body. All right, so now we're going to go back to the first side. We're going to do the same exercise again, but this time we're going to add some irradiation, some tension. So now it's going to become what we call a capsule car for the hip. So in order to create tension here, you can press down to the ground with your hands and your other leg, and you're going to move now your leg as though you're moving through a vat of maple syrup. Cold, sticky maple syrup. So you have to create some force in order to do that. You're not just waving your leg in the air, you're actually pushing your foot through that thick air, but you're thinking about using your hip rotation to do the foot push. So I want you to move your foot through that thick air. At the end of your rotation, I want you to try to push even a little bit further for a few seconds. Maybe that'll cause some cramping, that's okay. And then you're going to reverse, you're going to go a little further the other direction, pressing inwards all the way. And this is actually your external rotation. Internal rotation, moving through syrup, pressing a little further at the end, not hitching that hip. External rotation, coming all the way in. This is the one I find harder. Everyone's different. Just going through that one more time, pressing out and pulling that foot all the way in, thinking about the hip joint doing the work. Now other side. So lifting the right leg up to 90 degrees, solidifying the air around you into thick maple syrup, and rotating the thigh so your foot comes in. Remember, that's external rotation. Rotating your thigh so that your foot reaches out. That's internal rotation. Usually more crampy for most of us. Coming in through that thick maple syrup air, pressing to try to get a little bit more rotation. Moving through the thick air to get a little bit more internal rotation. Don't forget you're pressing down through your other foot, pressing down through your arms and hands. I'm just looking at my leg right now, which is why my head's in the air. You can just lay down, or you could, like I said, put your head on a block or pillow so you can look at your leg as well. Really trying to work through this range, pressing a little further for a few seconds at the end. Imagine you could make your leg go a little bit further on each cycle here. One more to the outside, one more to the inside, and letting that down. So hopefully your hips are nice and warmed up. We are going to do a Pails and Rails for external rotation because it's a little easier for most people to get into this position than the ones that we would use for internal rotation. But it is all possible. So today we're just going to experiment with external. Set yourself up near a couch or a wall with your feet probably around 90 degrees. And if you've been watching on Instagram, here you want to make sure that your pelvis is pretty neutral, which means you'll have a little curve under your low back. You can fit your fingers under there a little bit. And then you're just going to cross your right leg over your left knee. Reset your pelvis so you still have that neutral curve, and maybe you're feeling some stretch in the outside of that right hip, and that's what we're looking for. That's your external rotation. You can move yourself closer to the wall if you're so inclined. I'm just going to hang out here while I talk about what the Pails and Rails is going to be. So whenever you're starting Pails and Rails, you want to start with a passive stretch. Usually 2 minutes is good. We're not going to hold that for quite so long today, just so that you're not here forever, but I want to show you how to do it properly, so when you do it on your own, you can do it. So it's normally a 2-minute hold. And then a Pails is a contraction in the direction of getting out of the stretch. So if I was to move my other leg, I would go like that. I would no longer be in a stretch. So that's going to be your Pails contraction when we try it, is you're going to be thinking about using that hip to rotate your whole leg in this direction, but because your other leg is there, you're not going to be able to rotate your leg. It's just going to press into your other leg, and so that's an isometric because you're not moving physically as you're creating force in the muscle. And like I said, that teaches your nervous system that you're strong there, and when your nervous system feels good and strong, it might give you more range of motion in the direction we actually want to go. And the rails is when we start trying to go the direction we actually want to go, and that would be the direction of bringing our foot in more towards our torso, our body. That's the external rotation direction. You're almost certainly not going to be able to create any external rotation, but you're going to think with your mind and your muscles about trying to get your hip to create it for you. And that's when we do the rails contraction, which of course we're not doing quite yet. Okay, so Pails is as though you are internally rotating. Rails is doing your best to get more external rotation. Okay? So now that we've been stretching for a while, let's actually move into the Pails and Rails. I'm going to get my timer. I usually like doing about a 12-second increase in tension, a 12-second hold, and a 12-second rails. So for today, I want you to think about just working at about 50% of the total tension you could create. Eventually, you want to work up to 80 or 90% of your safest, greatest, maximum effort. But for the first time you do it, it's nice not to be crazy. You don't want to hurt anything. So starting now, you're going to start thinking about pressing your foot into your thigh bone, dialing up the tension to about 50%, and then 60%, and then holding at about that 50 or 60%, just smooth dial. Hold that 50 or 60%, try to be consistent, press into the ground with your hands, maybe press into the wall or pull the wall down towards the ground with your other leg. You're creating full body tension here as you're thinking about pressing your foot rotationally against your left leg. And now we're going to reverse that into the rails. Now you're going to pull your foot off your left leg as though you could rotate it towards your face. Feel some stuff happening in your hip. It might feel absolutely horrible. It definitely doesn't feel great to me. Holding, holding, holding. Still about 50% or 60% tension though. We're not doing anything too crazy here. And then relax and see if you can get a little bit deeper into the stretch. See if you can move your pelvis into more of an untucked position. See if you can inch your bottom towards the wall a little bit to create a little bit more pressure on that right hip joint. And we're just going to breathe here. So you want to think about, now that we've used things intensely, we want to let go of tension. We want to take nice slow inhales, nice long exhales to let our nervous system be like, oh, okay, we can let go. All right, so that was your external rotation pail and rail for the right leg. And we're going to move right in to doing the external rotation pail and rail for the left leg. If you were doing this on your own, you might want to do that 2 or 3 times for your right hip before you move to your left hip. So I'm not going to lie, this can take a while. I always think of Pails and Rails as being like the Buckley's cough syrup of the movement world. They don't taste that great, but they're very effective. This is a great exercise for creating true changes. Why don't you switch sides? My left leg is much more restricted than my right leg, so I need to move my butt around a little bit to get into a good position here. You're looking for a fairly neutral pelvis, so you're not tucking your pelvis, your lower back isn't flattened against the ground. You've got some stretch in the outer left hip, and everything else is pretty comfortable. And here you're going to keep working on some nice slow breathing to relax. So this passive stretching component is something you hold for 2 minutes because that is the time under tension that you need in order to create tissue changes. A 30-second stretch doesn't really cut it. So in the context of a YouTube video, I'm not doing this for a full 2 minutes, but if you're doing this at home and you want to see changes, then do yourself a favor and spend the time doing it, because otherwise you're not going to get the best results. 2 minutes. I use a timer on my phone called, what is it called? It's called Seconds. It's an app and you can set up timers for yourself. So for my Pails and Rails, I always love using that app. It's much easier than my phone timer. All right, so let's just review while we're hanging out here. Our Pails contraction is the first one. It's the one where we're internally rotating to try to kind of get away from the direction of stretch. The rails is where we're notionally externally rotating further to get deeper into the stretch. Okay, so they're both isometric. You're not going to see any movement. You're just notionally contracting everything that would externally rotate, and then you're going to contract everything that, you're going to contract everything that would internally rotate, and then everything that would externally rotate. And that's what creates the actual changes that will give you more range of motion. All right, so let's get into this. We're going to start ramping up, so you don't go right into your full 50% tension. You're going to dial it into 10%, pressing that foot against your leg, 20%, rotating through that hip. It's internal rotation, but the foot moves out, 30%, 40%, 50%, and hold that 50%, pressing into the ground with your hands, holding some tension in your abs, maybe pulling your right foot down towards the ground to create some tension in the back of your right leg. You're holding a nice even 50% tension. So your job is to try to control the tension so it stays the same amount of 50% the whole way through here. And then on my count, we're going to switch directions. You're going to start externally rotating in 3, 2, 1. Your hip is trying to pull your foot off your right thigh. You're going into 50, 60, maybe even 70% tension here, a little higher than the Pails. Really trying to create some movement, even if it doesn't move. Lightening your foot up off your thigh. Holding there, keep working at it. You're almost there. Keep pressing to the ground for tension. Keep tension in your other leg. And then in 3, 2, 1, relax completely and see if you can go a little bit deeper into that stretch. See if you can reposition yourself so that your body will give you a little bit more passive stretch. And breathe. Nice deep breath in. Nice deep breath out. So external rotation, internal rotation, they come before flexion and extension. So if you really want to get all this stuff, I have a course called Hip Hip Hooray, where I'm going to take you through all the Pails and Rails for internal rotation, external rotation, flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. It's got a focus on walking, but it's also going to be great for your squats. So that's a good option. Remembering you're letting go of tension here, easing your body into this new place that maybe it hasn't gotten to before, creating some new rotation in the hips. And then coming out. All right, so by working on rotation first, hopefully we've opened up a little bit of room so that now we can work on hip flexion. Hip flexion is the one that we want for our squat. This is a very different feeling than rotation, and it's a bit weird. I like this one, but it's a bit weird. So we're going to go back to our right leg, because that's the one we did first for Pails and Rails. You can hold yourself on your thigh here. You could hold yourself in front of the knee, but if you've got any kind of difficulty with knee flexion, it's probably better just to isolate the thigh. And we're going to try to work in a fairly neutral pelvis here. So again, the pelvis is not tucking. You're not trying to pull your lower back into flexion. You're trying to work more on hip flexion. So you want to use your hands or even a yoga strap to try to pull your thigh bone down towards your torso. Now you're probably not going to feel a ton of stretch in the back of your leg here, and that's okay. What you don't want to feel here is pinching in the front. So if you do feel a lot of pinching, maybe move your leg out to the side a little bit and see if that helps. Now if that still causes pinching, then that's a sign that maybe you need to work more on the rotational piece, and it would be better to skip this exercise for now. It may also be a sign that you need some manual work in the front of your hip to create some space, because usually when you're getting pinching in the front, it's because the bones in the joint are lacking space and are actually kind of not able to move because the thigh bone is running into the pelvis. And so just by stretching there and stretching there, you're never going to do any good to yourself. You're just going to jam into the bone. So if that's something you're noticing a lot of, then definitely it's a good time to go see a functional range release certified practitioner would be what I would recommend to help you create some space in the joints so that your mobility changes come faster and more healthily. All right, so we've been here for a while, so let's talk about the Pails and Rails, because we're about to get into Pails and Rails. So we know the Pails is trying to get out of the stretch. The stretch here is to be in deep flexion, so the Pails movement will be like you're trying to kick your leg out straight. It's going to be that back of your leg working to straighten. And the Rails is going to be pulling your whole hip back in further. So trying to like actively use your hip flexors to pull your thigh in towards your body. So that's a really weird feeling. Okay, so when you're ready, we're going to start increasing our tension. And again, we're just going to use a fairly light tension today, probably about 50%. But think about feeling the back of your leg start to press into your hands. Your hands aren't going to let your leg move, though. You're just using the backs of your legs to press. And see how hard you can press up to about your 50%, dialing it up nice and smoothly. You don't want to go into your 100% today. If you practice at home for a while, then go ahead, but not today. You're holding now your 50 or 60% tension. Frankly, I'm kind of getting shaky here. And we're going to hold for about 10 to 15 seconds. And then the rails will be using your hip flexors to try to create more hip flexion without flattening your low back on the ground. Holding here, and then 3, 2, 1, you're going to rails. You're pulling your thigh in. This is going to cramp like crazy for most of you. Don't worry about cramping. That's fine. You could almost press into your hand. So my hand here, I'm trying to push down with my leg bone. I'm not letting my low back move at all. Just working that strength in my hip flexors for another 3, 2, 1. Relax and use your hands to go a little bit deeper into flexion. Sink into that hip. Let the hip stuff relax. Breathe. Big breath in. Big breath out. Big breath in. Slower breath out. So that long exhale is going to help you access your calming systems in your body. So nice long exhales. Let that work go. It's weird, hey? I told you that one was weird. I think it's weird. I like it, but it's weird. So Pails and Rails really are, they're just one of those things where they're incredibly effective. They're not the most exciting exercise, and they're not the most pleasant exercise. So I try to make things fun. Sometimes I can't. But there's a sort of, I don't know, masochistic enjoyment about doing these ones for a lot of people, definitely myself included. You always feel like you've really worked after a Pails and Rails session, and you have, because what we're doing here is end range strength training. So you're literally doing weightlifting for these tiny little cells that are at the very end of your joint. So that's pretty cool. Let's straighten out the right leg now, and we're going to work on the left leg. So here, relaxing again. Trying to find, if you feel pinching, just open your leg out to the side. You'll probably be in a better place. It's less pinchy. Again, it's a sign you probably need to do more rotational work. If the rotational work doesn't help, then you probably need to see a manual practitioner to help you create some space in that joint. So don't keep mashing into a feeling of pinching in the front of your hip. But you may also find that pinching disappears just from relaxing here. So sometimes you can kind of get that feeling there's stuff in the front of your hip just because you don't go into this position very often. There's very few totally true blanket statements you can make about human bodies because we're very varied. All of us are individual and unique. So if you feel pinching, it's a warning signal for you to explore, work on it rotationally, maybe see a manual practitioner, maybe change your position. Just don't keep jamming into it, okay? All right, reminder on the Pails and Rails. Your Pails is going to be like you're kicking your leg out away. You're trying to use the back of your leg to extend your leg. Your Rails is going to be removing your hands and trying to use the stuff on the front side of your body to pull your knee into your chest. Make sure it's not about flattening your pelvis on the ground. If we wanted to do that, we wouldn't need to do all this hip work. Oh, I'm getting a horrible cramp. Cramping, by the way, is just a sign of neurological confusion. So it's not pleasant, but it's generally something where if you hang out in it, it will disappear. It's usually because you don't go into this range very often. And your body's like, why are we here? Which you might be asking as well by this point in our session. But I promise it's not too much longer. This is the way to get a better squat, though. If you're working on squatting, this is money stuff. Okay. So getting ready to Pails, you're going to think about increasing your tension slowly, dialing it from 10 to 20, up to 40, and then finally 50 or 60%. You're pushing out against your hands, back of your leg is working, your other leg is pressing into the ground, your whole body is tensioned. You're creating a fair bit of force here, but you're still thinking about 50 or 60% tension, not 80 or 90. Holding here. Try to keep your tension smooth once you've set it at 50 or 60%. Don't let that change. And then on my count, we're going to rails. So 3, 2, 1. Pull your knee towards your chest. Really work the front of your hip, pulling that thigh bone in towards your abdomen, not curling and tucking your pelvis. It's about the front of your hip here. You're working super hard. You can press down into your hand, so you can actually press away with your hand as you push your knee into your hand, and that will light things up like crazy. It's awesome. And we're going to hold it for 3, 2, 1. Now deeper. Can you go deeper into your hip flexion, not letting the pelvis tuck, just going a little bit deeper here, and holding and breathing. So here's our stretch again. All right, so let's come into that. It's usually nice to do at least 3 or 4 breaths there to relax. We're going to finish this with another round of those capsule cars. The capsule cars are great because we've got some change in the tissues, but not very much after doing that. It was mostly neurological. So the capsule cars are going to actually bring that change into our cells. It's like an upload. It's like hitting save when you write a document. So you know how crappy it is when you forget to hit save? So do the capsule cars. Right leg, 90 degrees, thinking maple syrup. You're working through that maple syrup range. Try not to let your knee wobble. It's just above your hip the whole time. Pressing into your external rotation, pressing all the way out into your internal rotation. Maybe it feels different now. Maybe it doesn't. All the way in, working, 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 pressing, 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 and all the way out. There you go. Pressing out, working through your range. As you rotate your thigh bone to face out, your foot comes in a little bit further. Try to get a little bit more out of your hip. Take your mind into your hip joint. We'll do one more both directions. This is your internal rotation. Don't hitch the hip. Press down to the ground with your other leg. Press down to the ground with your elbows. And then one more external, all the way. So your thighs really facing out. Try to connect in with your brain to your hip stuff and let that come down. Other side. Bring your knee up to 90 degrees. Think about pressing your foot through that thick, thick syrup all the way the other way, working through your range, pressing a little bit further at the end. This is your upload device. The capsule car is awesome. I have a whole class on them in my New Joints for Life course. Super my favorite things. Much better than Pails and Rails. Coming all the way through, trying to be nice and smooth and controlled the whole way. Definitely always a work in progress. Don't hitch the hip as you internally rotate. And one more time, externally rotating. And you can let that all go. All right, and if you want, you can go into your squat now and see if that feels like your normal squat does, or if it's changed at all for you. So this is just a little slice. I'm going to put some notes down into the video so that you know exactly how to use this for your personal program. There's a lot more hip mobility stuff you could work on, but this is a really nice little kind of introduction to it. Like I said, I've got a lot more on it in my Hip Hip Hooray course if you want to go deeper, but always think rotation before flexion. So you're going to probably want to work internal rotation, external rotation, and then flexion in that order in order to really change your hip ability for better squatting. Okay? So thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will catch you soon.